Grant Robertson.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and I'm sure my colleague Dr. Clark will join us shortly in this discussion. I want to talk mainly in this first contribution around the quite large set of clauses and amendments relating to the cashing out of research and development tax losses. But before I do that, I actually want to pick up where my colleague Stuart Nash just left off in talking about Clause 76, because I have to say that in the Select Committee we didn't have a long discussion about Clause 76. It did come up and there were a couple of amendments made to the clause as a result of the brief discussion we had. But I do think it's important to put on the record the concern that the Labor Party has that in making a change that is, as Mr. Nash noted, primarily about ensuring that there's consistency in the way that tertiary institutions are treated in terms of tax, be it in their role as a tertiary institution, educating people, be it a polytech or a university, providing, undertaking lectures, providing the normal kind of degree qualifications, if it was a university, that we would expect, and that the income that they derive is regarded to be exempted. What this clause does is put in place a regime for the subsidiaries of tertiary education institutions. And as Mr. Nash has noted, these now come in many forms, Mr. Chair. They run all the way from start-up companies based upon the research of a particular researcher at a university, all the way through to small limited companies set up by polytechnics to provide a particular kind of educational service that might be a bit outside the norm. So it could be the provision of a particular service to international students that is that's regarded as more of a company-based arrangement than the traditional polytech structure. So in trying to create a mechanism that encompasses all of those different new subsidiaries of tertiary institutions, something's missing in this clause, and there's an attempt to deal with the breadth of these institutions in the amendment that's now in what would be the new clause 55BA2, where a tertiary education subsidiary is a company in which tertiary education institutions alone or together with other tertiary education institutions holds voting interest in the company of up to 100% or market value interest in the company adding up to 100% when a market value exists. So that deals with the issue of universities or polytechs cooperating with one another. What it doesn't deal with is what is becoming more commonplace in the tertiary settings, particularly in the university settings, of different styles of ownership. These include, Mr. Chair, where individual academics are now starting to take some sense of ownership of these companies so that they've got their own identity separate from the tertiary institution that they work for. It's also the situation now where private investment does come in from quite an early point. Other kinds of investment comes in. We've got large research programs in our tertiary institutions at the moment funded by research funding organisations from other countries. So if we take the example of the terrific longitudinal study run down at the University of Otago, that study has been largely funded in recent times by the American NIH, by the UK research foundations. How are they going to be treated under this kind of situation? How is a company that spins out from the genetic research that's arisen out of that longitudinal study, how will that be treated in a tax sense? Now, we don't want a free ride here for companies that should legitimately be paying tax, but where they are genuinely research organisations developed out of a tertiary institution that has a slightly different ownership or share arrangement than 100%, what do we do? And perhaps the Minister and the Chair might want to take a call to say whether or not there is a different set of structures for those sorts of companies that are being considered. But certainly on this side of the House, we want to put on the record that we want to see an encouragement of the development and commercialisation of the research that happens inside our tertiary institutions. And any tax treatment that discourages that, as could be possible under this clause, provides us with some concern. I do note, Mr. Chair, in terms of this clause, there is a section around who controls the company, and there is an important change that was made in the Select Committee to delete, Mr Chair.
Grant Robertson, fourth call.
I beg your pardon?
This is your fourth call.
My fourth call on this part.
I'll let you know.
Gracious, it's been so long, Mr Chair, since the year's first two calls that I wasn't aware that it was my fourth call. I will briefly then complete the comment that I was making there, that there was a change made removing the question of whether an individual was going to benefit or advantage from the work of a company. That will help in the situation I mentioned before of where specific academics might have taken a share within a company separate from the university they work for. So I do recognise that matter's been dealt with, but I would ask that we get some clarification around making sure we're not setting up a regime that provides a disincentive to universities commercialising their research. Mr Chair, in the brief period that I have remaining to me to speak on this part, I did want to come back to the question of the cashing out of research and development tax losses, and largely because this is an area where the committee did make a large number of changes. The purpose of this is supported by members on this side of the House. The idea that we can provide at the early stage of a company's establishment the ability to cash out the losses from R&D. We want to see those companies investing in R&D from day one. And if this is the one way that we can do that, then we can support that. I would say, Mr Chair, that the government's reluctance to go down the path of a comprehensive research and development tax credit leads them to have to put in pages and pages of definitions and difficult to understand processes by which people will have to go through in order to work out whether or not they're actually eligible for this. But it is worth noting, Mr Chair, the changes that the committee made. So we're clear that under the proposals, R&D startup companies can claim up to 28%. That is the current company tax rate. That helps to be clear and simple about that. The main eligibility requirement is that the company must be a loss-making company resident in New Zealand with a sufficient proportion of expenditure on research and development. That was one of the areas that again presented some difficulty for us because of the potential for a range of ownership arrangements that would make a company primarily a New Zealand one, clearly being resident in New Zealand, and then that question of what is a sufficient proportion of expenditure on research and development. The amount of losses that can be cashed out has been capped at $500,000 for the 2015-16 year and increasing by $300,000 over the next 5 years to $2 million. Mr Chair, when we were discussing this in the committee, the issue that I wanted to raise was how R&D was defined and who would make up their mind as to whether or not this genuinely was research and development. And in the end, what we drew out as the discussion went on was that that role was effectively being outsourced to Callaghan Innovation. Now, Callaghan Innovation is a relatively new organisation, a good organisation in my view, doing some good things in our community. But there are still some issues for us on this side of the House as to whether or not Callaghan Innovation is the right organisation to be doing that checking, whether they have the scope of expertise to always know whether a particular or given company actually is undertaking research and development in their sphere. And for me, this highlights the concern we have that by creating a system where we don't have a broad-based research and development tax credit, we create a large number of hoops, we create a new role for a bureaucratic role, essentially, for Callaghan Innovation, whose job should be to be out there in the community supporting researchers to do research, not acting as some kind of judge in a sort of Dragon's Den contest about whether something is or isn't research and development. So again, we could have come up with something simpler, something that didn't involve so much hoop jumping. We understand that Callaghan Innovation is going to be paid for their work. That's fair enough. They're a company, they're a CRI who has to make sure that they pay their own way. But we think that there's the potential for this to be a fairly substantial distraction from the kind of work that they're going to do. Mr Chair, just briefly, the other clauses in here, and I would urge the Minister and the Chair or another member of the government who was on the Select Committee to actually work through, no, not David Bennett. Another member of the committee except for David Bennett, who could stand up and work our way through the eligibility criteria, the wage intensity criteria, why $500,000 was listed as the amount to be cashed out, and then particularly of interest to me, Mr. Chair, is the excluded activities. And I'd like to know about that.